Thank you for joining the Once Changing the World, which is India's first Future Tech meets Sustainability podcast. And today I'm delighted and honored to have with me Mr. Raj Samani, who's the Chief Scientist Officer at RAPID7. He was the ex-chief scientist at McAfee, and he has assisted multiple law enforcement agencies in cybercrime cases and is a special advisor to the Europol's European Cybercrime Centre. Mr. Samani has been recognized for his contributions to the computer security industry through numerous awards, including the Infosecurity Europe Hall of Fame, Szor Award, and Intel Achievement Award. Among others, he is the co-author of the book Applied Cybersecurity and the Smart Grid and the CSA Guide to Cloud Computing. So, Mr. Samani, really appreciate you taking time and being part of a humble podcast. This is something which I kind of pulled off the net. Why don't we start with a brief introduction, your background, and how you've been invested in the cybersecurity industry?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. People say, oh, well, you're in security, and there's a misconception that is almost a separate discipline to those that are technologists. But the reality is that I'm a technologist first and foremost. Like everybody else, I look to kind of introduce new technologies into my life or into my home with a view to making things and life easier. The difference, I think, is I try to understand the misuse of my data. I try to understand how my data is protected, and I look to ensure that not only for my own life, but I help articulate that for people that I work for, people that I work with, effectively helping to try to shape a society in which we can continue this digital adoption, but done so in a way that really doesn't endanger our future. And I know before we started recording, we started to discuss things such as elections, and we started to discuss things such as these huge data breaches. But that to me is just an example of how if you allow the adoption of technology to continue unabated without any consideration of effectively data, about any consideration of what that data can do and who it can access it, then I think we're going to live in a world in which we as human beings are just commoditized, and the only thing that people are interested in is information about us. And to me, that's not a world that I want my children to grow up in. So that's kind of my background and really kind of my beliefs, I think.
Right. You mentioned how today we've been pushed into the digital world, and it wouldn't be wrong to say that in the next few decades, almost all of the companies, regular traditional companies, are going to be tech companies. And in this world, I think data is going to play such a huge role. I mean, today we're building technologies, such as artificial intelligence, and they are very data hungry. They're dependent upon data. So we are harvesting data, we are manipulating data. You spoke about how we are misusing data and how data needs to be protected. But where do we stand in the world, in this world where everybody is talking about the technologies, and in all fairness, I think almost all of these technologies are akin to magic, because in the next few decades, the kind of benefits it's gonna open up for consumers as well as enterprise is going to be, it's pretty much unfathomable at this point in time. Right from your augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, your IoT sensorizing the entire world, artificial intelligence, 5G, but all of this kind of requires data. And so far, like you rightfully pointed out in the beginning of the conversation, that most of the organizations, including nations, are harvesting our data, manipulating us in ways which we don't even understand. So as someone who's an expert in the space, first of all, please educate us. What is the current way where the data is being used of us, the citizens and everyone, and what does the future hold?
Well, so ultimately, we don't know. And we've allowed this scenario to happen. And look, let me give you an example. So obviously you have a smartphone, right, Eddie? And how many apps do you roughly have on that smartphone? Can you tell me what data one of those apps collects? Can you tell me the permissions it has on your phone? Can you tell me where it sends that data, who it shares that data with, what they do with that data? Of course, we don't know that. And so we've almost allowed the fox into the hen house, because we wanted to have the flashlight app on our device. Okay, let's forget the fact that we have a torch on our device, but we wanted an app to do that. But we've done so in a way that we've almost kind of blindly allowed ourselves these organizations access into our very lives. And we forgot to ask the question, say, well, are you going to behave when you're here? And of course, the benefit for these companies is that their valuations are based upon the amount of data they collect. If you think about the most valuable companies in the world, they aren't the traditional companies that you would expect selling physical goods. Of course, Apple is probably probably not the best example of that. But you look at companies like, for example, like Facebook or YouTube or Instagram or Snapchat. I mean, these companies don't really sell a physical product. And so I'd say that the world that you've described, in which it is our data that is the most precious commodity, and I think it was said, data is the new oil. Well, that's been happening for over a decade now. And the most valuable companies out there are the ones that actually have the most data. And, I remember I was on CNBC. I was co-anchoring actually with Louisa Bushman. And, we actually got to discuss this on air. And one of the points that I was making was, the traditional kind of approach of valuations of companies based upon turnover and revenue. Yes, that still applies, but equally, the amount of data that it has and the amount of data that it collects and the potential use of that data is, I would say, probably now a more important commodity when it comes to valuations. And that, I think, is the world that we're living in which, our information is being harvested. We aren't the ones asking questions like, well, what are you going to do with it? And that, of course, has created a scenario in which you've got these massive data lakes collecting information about us, analyzing that data, and then leveraging that data for their own financial purposes.
How does a consumer enterprise go about protecting oneself, in this onslaught which is coming?
Well, I mean, it's actually really simple. If you don't want, you've got to ask the question, and you've got to, so there's been a lot of discussion about regulating the environment. And of course, we've had a lot of data protection regulations that have come in. But ultimately, I do feel that we as the market, and we are the market, we as the market need to say, no, I'm sorry, this is not going to be acceptable. And, I'll give you a really great case in point. If you remember, there was a kid's toy that used to have a camera inbuilt into a teddy bear, and kids could record video and could record voice and send that up to their cloud. And when this company got compromised, what happened was obviously they got called out for it, but they said, well, actually, they edited their privacy policy, and they said, well, we are not going to be responsible for any information that is accessed by unauthorized third parties. And of course, the regulatory authority says, well, no, this is not good enough. But I remember at the time I did a talk at Bletchley Park, and I tried to do careers talks at least once a quarter. And I asked parents in the room, and I said, well, how many of you still have this toy? And they, 20% of the audience put their hands up. And I said, and how many of you are aware that your information that your children developed and created was stolen by hackers, and the company then washed their hands of it, and not one of them put their hands up? And I said, so how many of you are now going to continue to buy their products? And they said, well, no, of course not. And that for me was a really good example of the challenge that we face, which is there is a sea and a wash of news that we simply can't keep a hold of. And yet we fail to understand the context and impact of these breaches and how it impacts us. But I think if we knew these things, we would make better decisions. And so that's why I think, podcasts such as yours are so important, because it helps educate people on, well, these are the things that I need to be aware of. And ultimately, we need to say, look, I'm sorry, but I don't agree with what you're going to do with this information. Therefore, I'm not going to allow you to harvest information about me. I mean,
right. I think, that's so profound, making people understand, the value of data, because I guess, somehow as consumers, we fail to understand the data that we are generating. It's not like a thought we kind of give into that there is an organization at the back end manipulating your data, what you're looking at, what you're surfing. I think, if there's more awareness in the space, possibly it's going to help. Now, tell me, I mean, you mentioned about this, toy which had a camera, which was a couple of years ago, but then today the entire game is changing. Today we have these virtual reality headsets, which has got inside, outside tracking, right? And there are these autonomous cars, which is for, which is going to come in the next possibly few years, maybe decades, who knows? But they're going to be fitted with cameras all around, regular cameras, lidars, 360 cameras, IoT, Internet of Things, which is going to be scanning the entire physical world. In this world where there is more and more data which is going to be harvested. I know I asked this question to you earlier also. As somebody who's an expert, how do we deal with something like this?
That's a challenging question, because look, we've seen examples of where this data has been used and manipulated in order to be able to influence things as important as like national referendums or things such as elections. And even this week we've seen a really tremendous story by Raphael Satter and Chris Bing over at Reuters talking about the Indian hacker for hire company and industry and the surveillance industry in terms of compromising and influencing things such as court cases. So the direction that it's going, I think the direction is concerning for sure. And we have to do everything we can to create an environment that affords us transparency, that affords us informed consent. So telling us what you're going to do with the data and then making sure that we're aware of it. I mean, we started in a world where we leveraged implicit consent. So we kind of said, well, we're going to take your data and we're going to do what we think is right. Well, clearly that's unacceptable. Then we moved to a world and everyone said, well, explicit consent is going to be the way forward. And of course, what happened was we kind of buried this in like 300 pages of terms of service. If we can leverage an environment where we have informed consent, whereby actually this is what we're going to do with your data, and then actually demonstrating and giving value back to the consumer. I mean, look, I don't mind giving away my data, but what I do is I make sure that I know what you're going to do with it, and then I get the maximum value I can commensurate with the data that I provide. That's the only thing we need to do. I mean, that's not a difficult thing to ask. Before, if I said, well, can I borrow your car and can I take it for a week? You're going to say, well, what are you going to do with it? So with a physical asset, we implement our own due diligence. With a non-physical asset, we don't. And I think, from a security perspective, there's a whole raft of things that we need to start to push and promote and encourage. Things like, for example, we do vulnerability disclosure policies. So what does a company do when it does get hacked? What does a company do to, like you talk about IoT equipment, how can an organization ensure that, they are allowing third-party researchers the ability to be able to research into their platforms, and what do they do as a result of it? I mean, the reality is criminals do that today, and we've seen ransomware groups offering bug bounties for zero-day vulnerability. So this kind of new world, and asking companies to say, well, what is your vulnerability disclosure policy? What is your privacy policy? What are you going to, these are important questions that I feel we need to ask in order to try to create an environment which has a level of not security and privacy, but really just kind of good standard common practice. And that should be the way that digital companies operate. I feel like this should be the norm and not the exception.
You have also assisted law enforcement agencies in cybercrime cases, and you've also been a special advisor to the European Cybercrime Centre in The Hague. So can you share some cybercrime projects that you have played a role in solving?
Well, so I'll tell you the one that I'm most proud of is Nomoreransom. This is an initiative that we put together, I think it was in 2016, and there was only 4 partners to begin with law enforcement and one other private sector company. And, we asked Amazon Web Services to host for us, and they now host the site for us. But we actually put together this initiative whereby we provide free decryption keys for ransomware. So as you know, ransomware is somebody gets inside your environment, encrypts data, and then forces you to pay a ransom in order to be able to unlock your information. So we kind of said, well, look, this is unacceptable. We can't live in a world in which hospitals can't provide patient care. So we put together this initiative, and we start, every time we take down criminals, if we get access to their decryption keys, we'll make those decryption keys freely available. And today, I think it's close to $1 billion that we've prevented going into the hands of criminals, because we've been working with law enforcement, we've been disrupting ransomware groups, we've been seizing their keys, and we've been making those keys freely available to anybody. And we don't ask you for your email address, we don't track your IP. We just simply provide you this free of charge. And for me, like that's something that I am most proud of. I think we won a SC Magazine award, and like I've had phone calls and emails from people saying, look, thank you, you saved my business, or thank you so much. I now have access to photos from my children or loved ones. And for me, that's something I'm most proud of. And we don't charge a cent for it either. So it's completely free of charge. You don't have to be a customer of ours. And now we've got over 150 plus partners with pretty much most law enforcement agencies and private sector companies on the planet.
Right. So you were mentioning that, there's lack of awareness on, that how we, produce so much data and we don't really care about it. Can we kind of throw some light on how nations, political parties, companies are leveraging our data, manipulating us, so we know that, okay, this is what's been happening, around the world,
I can't remember the year. A few years back, we did a joint study with a company called Safeguard Cyber. So they're a company that do social media analysis, specifically around the focus of misinformation. I mean, they do more than that, but that was one of the areas that I was most interested in. And we did some work, and we actually presented this at the European Commission. It was around the European parliamentary elections. And one of the things that we were able to identify was how the European parliamentary elections are being influenced by third-party nations as a vehicle to try to influence and push their own, national interests, rather than the national interests of the European Union. And it was incredible, because what we were able to do was we were able to kind of uncover, different countries had specific misinformation themes, I guess you could call, as a vehicle to try to influence national voting. And like that to me was tremendous, because we actually showed it to the commissioner, and we presented this research, and it kind of drove and it led, I guess, a movement within the European Commission to help try to track some of these themes. And now we're seeing tremendous efforts from, for example, the European Action Service or the European External Action Service as a vehicle to try to identify and try to put a stop to really interference from other nations with regards to our votes. And of course, we can talk about COVID, how we've seen influencing and misinformation campaigns driving people's belief that actually this was a conspiracy or it wasn't real. And misinformation is just an everyday part of our lives, and it's so simple to do, and it's multiple nations doing it. So yeah, it's the world that we live in today, right?
Could you delve a little deeper in that? Because with these AI deepfakes happening, how with misinformation, how deeply you think the world is going to get impacted?
It already is. I mean, it genuinely already is. Now, we don't know. You see, we don't know what we don't know. So we don't know if, for example, which elections were influenced. We don't know the national referendum. If, for example, Cambridge Analytica hadn't happened, would the vote have gone this way? So it's very difficult for us to kind of measure the impact that these influencing campaigns are having. But we have to acknowledge the fact that actually they are occurring, and in many ways they are having an influence on many people. Now, did that influence the vote to such an extent that actually that person wouldn't have got into power, or this country would not have left the European Union? I think that is something that we'll never truly know the answer of, right? I mean, we don't know what we don't know, but we do know that these types of things are occurring, and we do know that it is influencing people, and we do know that it is pushing votes. in a direction that is in the interests of a foreign government. That, to me, is deeply troubling. And of course, and that's the macro. And in the micro perspective, we've got, for example, examples whereby companies are, criminals were using deepfake videos in order to apply for jobs. If you remember this story just recently. So the deepfake is, I think it's just beginning. We're beginning to see the kind of the unique cases where deepfakes are being used for criminal purposes. And equally, we're seeing where deepfakes are being used for positive purposes. If you remember, I don't want to give it away, but the new Maverick film, the Top Gun film, I believe Val Kilmer's voice was actually a deepfake. So it is part of our everyday life. But of course, trying to quantify the impact is hard when it comes to crime, because we don't really know what would have happened. So that's the challenge that I think we've, and of course, that's the age-old issue of cybersecurity, which is trying to quantify the benefit or things like return on investment becomes very difficult to do.
Right. Yeah. Talking about, AI and deepfakes. I always try and point it out to the audience, that, technology per se is not bad. It's how you kind of choose it. That it depends upon that, whether it becomes good or bad. Now, I titled this topic, the role of cybersecurity in the metaverse. So, we are transitioning from Web 2.0 to Web 3.0, and we Facebook, a social media company, it rebranded from being a social media company to a metaverse company, and there's a huge hype. I think everybody is jumping onto the bandwagon in Microsoft, because there's Citibank predicted that by 2030, 2035, it's going to be an 8 trillion to 13 trillion market opportunity. So in this growingly digitized world where everything is being digitized, what is the role of cybersecurity over there?
Cybersecurity is the foundation of every single thing that we do. It is not a separate discipline. It is not something that is, it is the heart of every single thing that we do. Security and privacy needs to be, front and center, or really the foundation of, Web 2.0, Web 3.0. Heck, my kids will be talking about Web 10.0, right? It has to be the heart of what we do, because if you think about the way that we live our lives today, I think it was in the 50s, there was an anthropologist that went to Norway, to a fishing village, and talked about this construct of a social network, and the social network was based upon physical proximity. So in other words, your social network was derived of people that you were physically close to. And in 50 years time, in 50 years, we live in a world in which your social networks are barely made up of physical proximity. So for thousands of years, or over 1,000+ years, we used to make friends with people that were close to us. And now that doesn't exist in the space of 50 years. Today, I would challenge most people to say, well, the people that you interact with, the people that you spend time with, except for the people in your house, do you know the people in your street? And the answer for most people is probably no. So, and effectively the point that I'm trying to make here is that technology has fundamentally changed how we connect, how we communicate, how we build communities, how we shop, how we trade, every single facet of our life has been fundamentally turned upon its head. And we've had over 1,000 years to put the safeguards in place to protect us from harm, whether that's physical harm or somebody talking terribly about. But we've spent time as a human race to effectively put in those safeguards. For example, we use authentication by physically looking at somebody, going, "Yeah, well, you are Eddie, right? So I know it's you." But today, we don't have those same safeguards in place, because technology has moved at such a pace. I don't know if I'm talking to you or if I'm talking to somebody else. That's a level of trust that I've accepted. Whereas 50 to 30 years ago, we physically would have met, and I would have authenticated you, would have verified who you are. So security and privacy needs to be at the heart of what we do, because we're really literally defining who we are as human beings and what makes us human. right? Because, you remember, anthropologically speaking, the thing that sets us apart from Neanderthals is our communication and our language. Well, how we do that today has changed. So we have to make sure that we put those safeguards in place so that we can continue to grow and evolve as a species. These are the important questions we need to ask. And we're not even having those discussions. And that's what's troubling to me. I mean, we don't talk about, so we talk about autonomous driving, but we don't talk about liabilities associated with car crashes. We talk about, the automation of jobs, but we don't talk about, well, where does that leave most people if they don't have, if their job is automated? Like, for example, what's going to happen to the next generation of lorry drivers? So these are fundamental questions that I don't think we're having. And for me, that's a concern, because we are going to leave people behind. And there are whole sections of societies that are going to feel disenfranchised, disconnected, and quite frankly, aren't going to be economically rewarded. And therefore, the question becomes, well, what happens thereafter? So it is exciting, absolutely exciting. But I think as all of us as a society need to think about these big questions. And of course, security, privacy needs to be at the heart of all of these discussions.
Right. Yeah. I think in excitement to build things, we forget the impact which this technology could have. The bad side, the good side, obviously we're excited that, oh, we're going to have this autonomous level, autonomous driving, these XR glasses, possibly lenses, and automation is going to, leave us all, that it'll possibly automate everything, it'll save us so much money and stuff like that. But yes, like you rightfully pointed out, what happens to those the truck drivers? What happens to those people whose life depended, the families, which depended on the jobs, because even simple, these Indian banks at one point in time, for acquiring a loan, it used to be a process. Every bank used to employ at least around 100 people, to kind of, look at that process, right from going to the home of the people who need loan to, getting the tax papers, sending it, going through it and stuff like that. Right now, ICICI Bank has a 2-minute call. With their IVR, has a machine learning agent behind it, kind of opens up the CIBIL report of the individual, and in a minute it kind of understands, okay, whether that person is able to pay the loan or not. So the amount of people which has been displaced because of that is itself huge. So yes, I think we need to have these deeper conversations. But I guess excitement to kind of create a future which is going to be like big, bright, and awesome. I think we losing out on those fundamental questions that we as a society need to actually ask, and that what are we building and how is it going to really impact us. And I hope that we do that. You are the Chief Scientific Officer at RAPID7. Would you like to talk about the company and the products and services that you're building over there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, so I'm fairly new into the company, and I spent 12 years somewhere else. So I think I'm like 3 months in now. And, part of the reason that I came to RAPID7 was it is a company that, yes, has clearly focused on commercial aspects because it is a listed company. But what's really great about RAPID7 is that it has an understanding of its role within broader society, and it has so many projects that are community focused. For example, many people will know of Metasploit. Well, of course, Metasploit is managed now by RAPID7. It has Velociraptor, which for IR purposes is literally the tool of choice. And again, that's provided to the community, and things like Attacker KB. And so it's got so many initiatives that it kind of, for me, it's an important company because it understands the important role that it plays within shaping our society. And that really, for me, was the most attractive thing that led me here, which was, of course, I can, I can go to another company that is entirely commercially focused. But I kind of said, well, look, no, here's a company that yes, absolutely doesn't forget its shareholders, but for me, it understands the role and position that it plays within a broader society. And that to me was the exciting part, because of course, you know, I worked at a company for 12 years, and yes, we did community projects, but here is a company that kind of has its community focus really at the core and the heart of what it does. And that for me is what's so exciting about the company. And, you know, it's got tremendous products that it also sells, and services that it sells as well. But equally, it has this kind of other component to it, which for me is imperative, because of course we're at the sharp tip of the spear. And, you know, earlier you talked about the roles that I did with law enforcement, but, you know, when we do work with law enforcement, it's there to try to hold those to account that are actually carrying out attacks against our way of life. And of course, for me, there is this kind of balance that I place between, yes, absolutely having that commercial focus, but making sure that, you know, the work that we do has a broader impact on society. And I think, you know, RAPID7 does that completely.
You've been, you know, 12 years, you were part of McAfee, and John McAfee apparently killed himself in the prison. And as someone who has been part of McAfee and has worked closely with him, how dangerous is the world of cybersecurity? And maybe share your side of the story of John's life and death if possible.
Well, you know, I can't talk to John, honestly. You know, it's not something that I kind of feel like I could talk to, but I mean, is cybersecurity dangerous? I mean, look, it can get worrying, I think, when you think about, you know, the crimes that are carried out and conducted through digital means. I mean, like I said, like there's, you know, most crime today has a digital component to it, and so, I mean, I think, look, it's just something that you've got to do. I just feel like it's something, as cybersecurity professionals, anything that we can do to help and support our public sector partners in a true partnership to hold those to account that are trying to disrupt our way of life. I think we just have to do that. And, you know, like I've always been involved with security industries and security communities. I mean, I'm with the Cloud Security Alliance today. I was with the ISSA for years. You know, I ran mentoring programs, and today, like, you know, I run teams that understand what nation states are doing when they try to steal money from us, try to disrupt our way of life, try to hold hospitals ransom. And for me, it's important for us to try to give back to the society, because we are the ones that are, you know, with law enforcement, we're very much on those front lines. We actually see these attacks in real time. So anything that we can do to help create a safer society, it's something that I'm going to always try to do. And for me, the thing that I enjoy the most, quite frankly, is, you know, I'll go to a school at least once a quarter and I'll talk to kids about getting into the industry as well. And, you know, it's great to see that, and that there are people that I've spoken to over the years that are now in the industry, and I'm really happy that I've in some small way helped try to kind of hopefully inspire them to get into this industry, because it is. My son wants to be a footballer, and he said to me, you know, Dad, and for the American audience, it's soccer, right? But he says to me, Dad, you know, I want to be a footballer, but if I'm not going to be a footballer, I'm going to go into cyber. And I said, you've got it wrong way around, son. I said, this is way more exciting than playing football, honestly. I said, like, if you want to be a rock star, then fair enough, right? I'll give you that. But it's such an incredibly exciting and rich industry of, you know, tremendous people putting hours and hours and hours to make themselves better, doing everything they can to protect the world effectively is what we're trying to do. And I would encourage anybody listening to this, like, if you're at a crossroads and not knowing what to do, just look at this industry, look at this as a career. I'm so happy I've decided to, I went down this path, and it's so incredibly rewarding, and it's really exciting as well.
Right. Yeah, yeah. There are a lot of people actually who bring down social media, especially Facebook, and possibly rightfully so because of maybe the Cambridge Analytica and the way they are using the data. But the other side, like you rightfully pointed out, if not for social network, I think there is no way we would have been in the world that we are today. Where we can freely interact with anyone. Create relationships. Create businesses, and internet itself, I think is one of the biggest teacher. I mean, you could be sitting in an urban place or a rural place. If you have internet and your desire and intent, you have these MOOCs, massive open online courses, education which is freely available. So the only thing that stops one is possibly the desire and intent. My last question to you, so Yuval Noah Harari has written a book and he says that humans are now hackable because of the technology, because we have these, brain-computer interface, virtual reality devices, artificial intelligence, deep fakes, how things are being used to earlier just being manipulated through social media. Right now, it's getting more and more, potent. Now, you had written a white paper titled Hacking the Human Operating System. So would you like to paint a picture on how do you see the next 10 years, the role of cybersecurity, and if we are not aware of our data and our privacy and our security, how do you think organizations and individuals are going to get manipulated?
I'm going to say humans have always been hackable. Like, let's not kid ourselves. There are, misinformation is not new. Misinformation has been happening for decades. We only have to look at, 1930s Germany to see how social engineering happened at an industrial scale. The reality is that the means of digital means that actually the ability to be able to influence has become quicker, faster, and more automated. So we as human beings, and if I'd encourage anybody to read the book by Robert Cialdini called Influence, and he talks about the 6 levers that are used to influence human beings, and subconscious levers, by the way. So the suggestion that actually, social networks have created an environment in which people are now hackable, whereas they weren't before, I think is ludicrous. But the next 10 years, well, look, I'm going to try to paint a really positive picture. We live in a world today in which it is frictionless, and we live in a frictionless society in which I can start a business, I can hook up with an old, person I used to go to school with 20 years ago, or I can book a flight with, in less than sort of 3 minutes. I mean, it literally has become such a phenomenal environment. And I think this frictionless society will continue such that life is and will become easier. But the direction and what it's going to look like in 10 years, I would say, is down to you, Eddie, and down to your audience and down to the people on this world. We can take a left turn and live in a society in which criminals have more information about who we are, and what we do. And not just criminals, but like commercial companies and billionaires have more understanding about us than about us, right? They know about our intent based upon the data that they have about us. And that to me is not a world I want to live in. Like anybody that's seen, kind of sci-fi movies such as Blade Runner will understand that we don't want to live in a world in which, billboards change based upon when we walk by them, right? That's not a world we want. Or we can live in a world in which our private thoughts are our private thoughts, but we use technology to help enable and further us as a society. And that can only be done with your help. If you want a society in which your car isn't going to be holding you hostage before it takes your wife to the hospital because, the baby is coming and you've got to pay 20 Bitcoins to get to the hospital, well, guess what? That comes down to you. The decisions that you make, the questions that you ask, and what you demand of the people that you give your money to and your data to. That's up to us. And I'd like to think, with people like yourself and people like your audience, that we'll take that right-hand turn and we'll live in that society in which technology will enable us and won't leave whole sections of society behind. And so I'm excited what the future holds. I'm really happy to be in this industry whereby we can really help shape this future. So yeah, like I said, it's up to you. The future is down to you.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you for taking time, being part of the podcast and sharing your insights. Yes, we're living an exciting period of time in human history. For the first time, I think you could be sitting any place in the entire world. But if you have a desire and intent and internet connection, you can, build businesses and do some really, really cool things. And you rightfully pointed out, I think it really depends upon us. We need to be more aware, educate ourselves on a data privacy and security, and be safe, because you mentioned that we have let the fox in the hen house, and yeah, that is itself dangerous. But yes, I hope that we are more aware and we create a better future together. So really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. And to my listeners, if you like what you see in here, then please press the subscribe button, and until next time, see you guys. Bye. Thank you. I really appreciate this.
My pleasure. Thank you.